Hello and welcome to this joint ProCon Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire webinar. I'm Umesh Desai and I'm the chair of ProCon Leicestershire. As you're aware, ProCon has been connecting professionals in property and construction since 2000 in Leicestershire and 2018 in Nottingham, and we're delighted that you've joined us for this afternoon's event. Following on from our successful April webinar on net zero carbon's policy and playbook, we thought we'd take a closer look at some of the developments regionally. These schemes are currently delivering for a society more aware of the climate change emergency and a need to achieve net zero carbon. Today you'll hear from our project team who are working on new St Margaret's bus station in Leicester, Anish Chauhan from Arcadis, Tom Hewitt from BDP and Matthew Raitt from CPW. We'll talk about the design proposals, the sustainability strategy implementation and the technology that they're looking to use in order to achieve net zero carbon in operation and improve quality of life. This will be followed by Alasdair Donn, Head of Building Performance, Group Sustainability from Willmott Dixon, who will give an insight into a delivery of a number of the residential and non-residential developments. As always, we'll be hosting a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar with assistance from Danielle at Cartwright Communications, where we'll be answering any of your questions. If you have a question for any of them, simply type it into the box below and we'll be answering these in a little while. You can also use the upvote function if you see a particular question you'd like to know the answer to. So please make use of this, as we'll be able to make sure we answer the question that you're most interested in. But for now, without further ado, I'll pass you over to our first speaker this afternoon, Anish Chauhan from Arcadis.
Hi, I'm Anish Chauhan and I'm from Arcadis. As part of this webinar, we will be focusing on the redevelopment of Leicester St Margaret's bus station and surrounding highways improvement works. I will be firstly providing a short background on net zero carbon, Leicester City Council's strategy and vision, before giving you a project overview. I will then hand over to my colleagues Tom at BDP and Matthew at CPW, who will be diving into the detail around the various aspects of the building and M&E design, philosophy and strategy that has been adopted to achieve a net zero carbon building. So just diving into the detail and a bit of history of the targets that we need to achieve. The UK government requires all UK industry and businesses to be net zero carbon by 2050. And by 2035, we are also required to cut emissions by 78% compared to 1990 levels. This development of the bus station will regenerate a rundown but a very important gateway into Leicester. The striking new building will be glazed from floor to ceiling, feature a curved aluminium roof. Sustainable and renewable energy measures will contribute to achieving net zero carbon from an operational perspective. This scheme is partly funded through MHCLG, so the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government Department, through the Get Britain Building Fund, and there is a further contribution from the European Regional Development Fund to support the installation of PV panels. The authority has been working quite hard to reduce the city's carbon emissions to become more of a sustainable city. This project puts kind of Leicester at the forefront of achieving this ambition, as it is believed to be the first net zero carbon bus station in the UK. The approach to net zero carbon is achieved through operational energy, which CPW will present on further. Just looking into kind of LCC's strategy. So like many local authorities, Leicester City Council has declared a climate emergency. And after public consultation, they are now in the process of implementing a climate emergency strategy and action plan. So the authority is working to improve air quality to encourage a more of a greener, healthier lifestyle. Recent examples of this are the pop-up cycleways that you may have seen introduced through the city during the COVID pandemic, and more recently the introduction of the electrical bike share scheme, and also a new fleet of electric buses powered by 100% of renewable energy, which will be replacing the diesel vehicles. At the previous webinar, Energy and Sustainability Manager Anna Dodd provided details on LCC strategy and dived into the detail. But to recap, there were 6 themes, which were at home, travel and transport, consumer choice and waste, at work, land use, green space and development, and the council. This project delivers on 2 of those 6 themes, and the focus is on the council, which has owned and operated the premises, and through travel and transport. This project helps the council deliver its vision by becoming a more of a carbon neutral and a climate adapted city by 2030. And this has been delivered in terms of through the infrastructure and the services for promoting walking and cycling, through low carbon public transport and electrical ultra low emission vehicles and charging. Now moving into obviously the project and providing an overview, Arcadis have been appointed by Leicester City Council to deliver a complex inner city centre regeneration scheme. The scheme comprises of a redevelopment of a regional bus and a national coach station, including all the works to the adjacent highways, involving one of the city's busiest inner ring road junctions. Now, as part of the design process, several sustainable factors were considered. Firstly, we have been working with LCC to retain and reuse the structural steel frame. Now, by doing so, and I'm sure most of you agree, this yields significant environmental savings compared to recycling at a time where there is growing pressure in our industry to become more resource efficient, reduce waste, and lower embodied carbon impacts. Secondly, a number of sustainable technologies have been incorporated into the scheme, such as PV, air source heat pumps, electrical vehicle charging points for a number of the city's electric buses, and the electric cycle docking station. Through the implementation of these, we have been able to reduce and offset the building's demand for energy to achieve net zero carbon. This will save equivalent to 96 tonnes per annum. This project demonstrates Leicester City Council's commitment and standard for projects and developments going forward. Thirdly, from a highways perspective, we are providing safer, better connected and more attractive walking and cycling infrastructure in line with other cycle lanes formed throughout the city. The accelerated programme delivery timescales has meant multiple activities have been carried out simultaneously in order to achieve the station highway works completed in line with MHCLG funding requirements. Project funding was awarded back in August 2020 and planning approval was obtained in January 2021 of this year. In order to maintain an accelerated programme, the building and demolition was procured separately and completed in April of this year. We've recently appointed Morgan Sindall as the main contractor to deliver the project, which will be completed in Q1 of 2022. I will now pass over to Tom to present the building design.
So thanks for that, Anesh. My name's Tom Hewitt. I'm director at BDP, and when the council first approached us about this opportunity, obviously they had some fairly clear objectives that they were trying to achieve, and anybody that's familiar with the environment pre-demolition of the station will recognise that the public realm needed some significant enhancement. There was a requirement to get National Express facilities incorporated, which currently sit out onto the street and obviously compromise the traffic and the safety there. The environment itself is very narrow and quite dark. The council obviously wanted to increase the operational capacity in line with their specific objectives for improving transport generally across the city. And moving on to the interior, they're obviously very conscious that it was quite an industrial kind of character environment. And they wanted to make a much more light and airy and welcoming environment for the increased customers, increasing the number of customers. So they also wanted to try and improve any commercial offers that they could within the station. And looking at the exterior, it doesn't really cut the mustard in terms of the quality of the environment that this is trying to achieve. And so quite a heavily compromised industrial sort of environment when you see it from Burley's Way. So we looked at a whole range of different options which configured the site differently and with the objective of trying to create both a characterful environment, but also one which increased the overall capacity and improved the circulation as much as physically possible. And whilst some of these objectives did increase capacity, usually they either, this is at the expense of either customer safety in terms of people having to either cross the apron or cross between sort of zones where the stands are located, but also created a whole series of separate different buildings, and obviously more buildings, more expensive, more complexity. And so you end up coming back to the point where you might as well keep things more or less in the location that they are. And so that's where we started to look again. If you're familiar with the bus station as it was, you'll recognise that the body of the capacity within the centre was all located on the sort of west, so east and southeast sides. And so effectively all of the capacity blocks off your visibility into the concourse area and created a very blank series of facades with almost no windows into them. The definition of the bus bays to the north, which is sort of a sensible logic at the time, actually restricts the number of buses that you can get there and doesn't give you any flexibility. You know, there's 18 chevrons, there's 18 buses, and that's it. So obviously we wanted to sort of overcome that. The public realm we've already mentioned, but it's weak on the Burley's Way side as well as the Gravel Street side, and so it was something again we wanted to try and address. The bridge which used to cross over Burley's Way and land right at the end of the bus station here is an odd feature anyway, but that's been since removed, and obviously that's allowed us to consider expanding the facility to the north. The other thing to point out is that none of the entrances seem to line up with your approaches to the bus station itself, whether it's from Burley's Way itself, compromised by the bridge or trees, or from the approaching streets, you know, and so you're presented with blank walls in each of those situations. So that again is something we felt was important to overcome. So conceptually, we've looked at two fundamental sort of issues here. The first is a retention of the existing structure, reusing the building as far as we physically could is obviously very sensible in commercial terms, but also in program terms. And anybody that's aware of the steel prices rocketing at the moment will recognise that anything we can do to mitigate the amount of additional steel work we need to procure for this is going to be sensible. The overall conceptual approach here is then to consolidate all of that capacity that was previously around the site into one area as far as physically possible. So you can see that we've grouped the majority of the capacity over two levels now that the location allows that. And that both increases the capacity but makes it much more efficient as well. And that then becomes a building element which separates off a new National Express facility to the north side that you can see, but also allows us to open up the whole of that concourse to achieve some of those specific objectives that the council wanted to consider. You can also see that we've taken a straight line for the bus stands rather than following the chevron pattern of the stands themselves. And this obviously gives us a lot of flexibility in the future. So hopefully there's some future proofing identified. And you can see also that we've tried to open up the corners and also create straight lines of visibility. So you can see your entrance and your target of getting into the bus station from the approaches. As I mentioned, the sustainable objective has been implicit from the start within the brief. And whilst reusing and repurposing the existing structural frame is a good solution as a base point, architects will nearly always now be looking at mitigating other energy consumption issues. So maximizing your daylight to minimize the amount of lighting you're having to drive, and also minimizing the amount of solar gain you get, to which saves on the energy costs associated with cooling that environment, are pretty fundamental to this. And they supplement the, they start from a passive, sustainable approach right from the outset. And obviously this is then, we can capitalize on that with, as Matthew will describe later on, in terms of the specific net carbon zero objectives. And here you can see how, extending the eaves on the building in strategic locations allows us to both minimize the impact of solar gain, but also maximize the sort of daylight through the concourse. And obviously we're also looking at how we can use activated ventilation so that there's a cross flow through if things do get particularly sort of warm outside. So I'll leave you with a before and after image for from Burley's Way, and also the before and after on Gravel Street. And obviously we're looking forward to delivering the project in the form that you can see here in the immediate future. So I'll hand over to Matthew and he can talk specifically about the sustainable objectives and how we're achieving net carbon zero. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. So my name's Matt Wraith. I'm from Couchpay Wilkes. We're the M&E consultants on the project. I'm just going to demonstrate to you how we've met the net zero carbon targets. I'm going to refer back to the ProCon webinar that happened a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, sorry, where John Alker from the UK Green Building Council set out the definition for net zero carbon. So moving on to the definition for net zero carbon, this slide sets out the requirements of the different phases of the project. So to the left of the diagram is the pre-construction phase. So that's all of the carbon that's gone into the materials in the construction process. Then there's the beige phase in the middle where we're working. That is the operational energy use. So we're offsetting the regulated and unregulated carbon emissions for the operational energy use. And that's all done on site. So there's no off-site payment, there's no carbon offset going on. It's all done through a PV array on the roof, which we'll come on to talk about later in the presentation. But just referring back, just want to point out that, as John alluded to in his presentation, realistically, to offset that embodied carbon, we would be looking at some sort of off-site solution. So we've not gone down that route, but what we've done is offset all of our operational energy use on site. So in terms of the actual definition from the UK Green Building Council, we're required to offset the base building carbon emissions. So that's the purple colour here represented on the slide. So that's the landlord areas or the Leicester City Council areas, which represents about 80% of the floor area of the building. This diagram actually shows then the carbon emissions related to each tenant's area of the building. So as you can see by the large bar, that's the Leicester City Council, the landlord areas, as you would expect, it's the dominant area, and that represents about 75% of the carbon emissions of the building. So what we're actually required to offset is around about 96 tonnes of carbon. Now that bar is split into two. The top portion of it, approximately 1/3, represents the regulated carbon emissions, and that includes all of the energy efficiency measures that we've applied, so all of those good practice things like your LED lighting, which come on to speak about later. That's all taken into account in reducing that bar already. Then the dark blue element is the unregulated energy consumption. And this is that harder to get bit. It's out of our control as designers. It's the small power, the appliances, it's cooking consumption, that sort of thing. And that's why John referred to it as the stretching target. So we're offsetting all of the emissions for both regulated and unregulated for the base building. So this slide then demonstrates how we've achieved that. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a large PV array on the roof. In fact, it's a 230 kilowatt peak array. And that's able to then offset, as you can see in the first bar, the regulated emissions, and then the second bar all the way down to zero carbon for the unregulated emissions as well. And that's how we demonstrate compliance with the net zero carbon target for the Green Building Council. And just for completeness, this diagram actually represents the building regulations assessment. So again, the first bar shows the actual reduction achieved through energy efficiency measures. And then the right-hand bar shows the further carbon offset achieved from the PV on the roof. Now, again, I just want to highlight that this is exceeding the building regulations requirements. So the carbon, as you can see here on this diagram, is reducing approximately 40 tonnes of carbon emissions, where our PV array has a further 64 tonnes to add on top of that building regulations requirement. So as John alluded to, we're reaching the stretching target of the Green Building Council's definition, but we're also reaching the minimum target, as he alluded to, for local authorities for the building regulations element, which is the regulated carbon emissions for the whole building, including all the tenant areas. Okay, so I'm just going to talk now about the M&E solution. We've avoided a fossil fuel consumption entirely. We've gone with an all-electric solution, so very much in line with the government's decarbonisation strategy. We needed a lot of glass on the project because of the type of building it is, that connection with the buses outside. The people need to see outside and into the building. Therefore, the building fabric had to be really enhanced to kind of offset that glazing element. Now, a product of having a lot of glass, of course, is lots of natural light, which is great, but the risk is overheating. So we put a lot of effort into mitigating the overheating risk. Some of the diagrams there to show the sun path analysis that we did. But the main element for that was the large overhang that goes all the way around the building, obviously offers rain canopy as well, but really it's there to control the solar gains. A big decision on the project was about the concourse. Obviously, it's kind of 70% of the floor area of the building. And the key decision there was to unheat the concourse, simply because we're going to have a large infiltration load with people coming in and out of doors all the time, lots of air leaking in and out. Therefore, the decision to keep the space unheated was sensible in terms of energy efficiency. Then we can just treat the tenant areas within the building itself. Still have an external thermal envelope, but have an unheated concourse area. Another benefit of having the glazing was that we could have lots of window openings for natural ventilation. So we're able to have a nice, light, airy strategy, which was the brief in the first place for the concourse. Then on top of that, then we've got zone tenant areas, so that if any one of the tenant zones was unoccupied for a period of time, it could still operate efficiently because those services could be isolated. And one other thing I just want to highlight is a bit of a contradiction between the energy efficiency and the function of the building was the cafe area. So we've got a cafe tucked away in as part of the concourse. Now, from an energy efficiency point of view, I want that box sealed because we're treating the air within the cafe space. However, from a retailer's point of view, they want it nice and open. So I just want to highlight that because it's one of the contradictions that we work through between the function of the building and trying to achieve the zero carbon status. The other sustainable solutions for the project, as I mentioned before, we've got our roof-mounted PV array doing all of our carbon offset on site. Some of the other solutions we've got the electric bus charging elements, we've got the electric bike charging elements. So not only are we offsetting the emissions from the building, but we're starting to provide that low carbon economy solution for all of Leicester, and also starting to offset the emissions from the transport sector as well. So in summary, we're achieving the net zero carbon target for both the Green Building Council's definition for operational energy and also the building regulations requirements, so what we would traditionally sort of see as planning requirements. We're getting not only cost savings, program savings from keeping the existing steel structure, but obviously the embodied carbon savings of keeping that existing steel are huge, as are the carbon savings from retaining the existing apron where the buses are outside. We've got lots of natural light into the building whilst controlling that solar gain. So we've managed to achieve that light and airy feel in the concourse area, but in an energy efficient way. Obviously, the development's going to provide a huge boost to the city in that area. It's quite a key gateway into the city, and hopefully this is the catalyst now for regeneration of that part of the city centre. It's encouraging, again, low carbon solutions in terms of transport around the city, very much in line with the highway strategy. We see cycle lanes being installed. Also, it connects the city's transport hubs between the various transport sectors. It's a flagship project for Leicester City Council, very much supporting their climate strategy and that move now towards the 2030 target of achieving carbon neutrality. Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. I'm Alasdair Donn from Willmott Dixon, and I'd just like to share with you some of our experience on net zero carbon buildings and the challenges that those have posed and how we've overcome them. So in terms of challenges, I'm aware that a number of you on the call this morning will have, along with all of these organisations shown here, will have declared climate emergencies for your organisations, and we'll be facing the issue of how you deal with net zero carbon as a challenge for your existing estate and also for new build projects. So The good news is that lots of clever organisations, far brighter than myself, have come up with some fantastic definitions of both what net zero carbon means for us as a construction industry and a development community, and to give us some extremely good guidance. So I'd encourage all of you to read these documents if you haven't already, and I'm going to be referring to them as we go through today. So to break down the challenge of net zero carbon buildings into some steps that we can digest in a more bite-sized way, the clever folk at LETI, London Energy Transformation Initiative, have come up with some nice graphics and ways of explaining net zero, and you'll see a number of those referenced as I take you through the journey of how we've approached that. So Willmott Dixon as an organisation has committed to adopting the UK GBC net zero framework and also LETI's approach to net zero carbon in the projects that we're delivering over the next 10 years. So to break that carbon life cycle of a building down into chunks, if we look at the amounts of carbon that are emitted in a construction project, we've got a big chunk at the beginning, which is associated with embodied carbon, all of the materials and processes to deliver the project to a stage of PC. Then we have a number of years of operation where that building's using energy and emitting carbon associated with that energy, and some lumps of embodied carbon that are associated with replacement and maintenance of kit. And then finally, at the end of life, we've got some issues around how we dispose and recycle or reuse that building and the carbon emissions associated with that. So that whole life cycle is divided into both embodied and operational carbon emissions. And the principle of net zero can be defined in two ways. One is that all of the operational carbon that's associated with any new building or development that we create is offset or balanced by equal amount of carbon in terms of renewable energy or offsets of emissions reductions elsewhere, so that basically that new development is net zero, does not create any net carbon emissions as a result of it operating. And if we want to take it a step further and look at whole life carbon, what that would entail is that all of the emissions associated with the entire life cycle of the building, from its raw materials all the way through to the end of its life, are covered by that renewable offset and renewable energy offset and balance. And that's a much more challenging target, and one that's worth thinking about in terms of how we define which of those two things is important to to yourselves as an organisation when you're aiming for net zero projects. I'm going to focus today primarily on operational carbon, but touch a little bit on embodied emissions as well. So to break down any given project into, what do the steps look like to deliver a project? The most important one of those is the first one, and that's to make sure that the amount of energy that our building our homes are using is as low as possible, to drive that down to the lowest feasible level that's economically achievable for the project. So how low do we need to go? That's the question that is perhaps at the heart of net zero buildings. You'll see there some energy intensity figures in terms of energy used per square metre of building per year. And the blue bars are showing what a typical building of that type would use currently. And the red bars are showing what kind of energy efficiency or intensity levels we would need to get to meet the net zero definitions within UK GBC's framework and LETI and so on. And you can see there that they vary a bit from project to project or sector to sector, but they're of the order of sort of 50 to 60% typically of improvement relative to the current state of an average building of that type. So and typically better than we would have traditionally aimed for in new build, in the current regulatory environment. So how do we do that? There's a number of different solutions, but one of them that I'd like to touch on today a little bit is Passive House. You can see there the kind of energy efficiency standards that Passive House sets, and it's kind of in line broadly with the targets that net zero buildings require. So if you're building to Passive House, you're kind of automatically ticking the step one of the net zero energy efficiency box. In terms of Willmott Dixon and our passive house journey, you'll see there 3 large projects that we've delivered, which I'll talk about a little bit today. A couple of schools and a big higher education building, and 4 other projects that we currently have in our pre-construction pipeline. And you can see there, a variety of different building types and approaches that that Passive House delivers. The University of Leicester building here that we constructed about 5 years ago now has been a great success for the university, heart of their campus, and replacing some quite aging assets for the university's medical school. See some images there of the interior of the building, high quality space, in terms of the environment and the building, although it's achieving passive house levels of energy efficiency, not substantially different to any functional building of that type. So passive house delivers both high energy efficiency, great air quality, and environmental standards in terms of comfort and building space. So an interesting approach, and one that I'd recommend you investigate. Another project that we completed is interesting from a net zero carbon point of view. Achieves the Passive House Plus standard, which is essentially all of the energy efficiency benefits that Passive House gives, as well as an additional amount of renewable energy. So you can see the figures showing the energy demand annually and the amount of renewable energy generation from the solar PV systems on the building, which are in excess of the energy demand on an annual basis. So that makes it essentially net zero inherently in terms of its energy efficiency and renewable generation. And we'll talk about that in a sec when we look at solar PV in a bit more detail. Step 2 in that journey of net zero buildings is, once we've reduced the energy, what do we then want to consider to do with embodied carbon and all of those issues around the materials and the processes and everything that goes into creating the building in the first place. So if you remember that graph, that's given, I'd encourage people to pick up a copy of the LETI Embodied Carbon Primer, which goes into lots of really good practical detail about how embodied carbon can be assessed and also reduced in terms of design processes in a project. You can see there an example of the figures given there. They're looking at specific metrics that are measurable through various tools that can be used on projects to measure the embodied carbon in kilograms per square meter. Give some metrics of what kind of typical levels are currently achieved and what kind of target values we should be aiming for in a net zero building. And essentially the key message there is measure it. We don't put figures on this in construction projects routinely these days, and that's very much the first step, and the step that Willmott Dixon's taking on our projects is to robustly assess and develop options for reducing that embodied carbon. So one of those is a residential project that we're currently about to launch, which is a standardized and bespoke way of making residential development homes which achieve net zero carbon in operation and also have been optimized for running costs and embodied carbon reductions through their life cycle. We want to show that through projects and offers like this that these things can be practically delivered in today's environment. So the third step in our net zero building is, having reduced our energy, thought about our embodied carbon, is to balance that carbon emission with low carbon energy supply. And the method that we've used most extensively currently in the projects we're delivering and find to be an excellent solution in terms of performance and outcomes is solar PV generation. You can see there one of the buildings that we've created at the University of Warwick on the biomedical research building, using PV in a kind of innovative way to both vertically and horizontally to maximize the amount of generation from the building and also replace some plant screen items that would otherwise have to be made from other materials. So a reduction in embodied emissions there, as well as generating renewable energy. You see in the second image there, one of the largest PV systems currently operating in the Netherlands on a building rooftop. It gives you some idea of the scale of this technology. And in the final picture, one of the largest ground mount solar parks in the UK currently being constructed in Kent to generate 350 megawatts of energy in solar power terms. That's roughly a quarter of Hinckley Power Station at peak output. This technology is being constructed at scale, and what that allows us to do is create some significant economies of scale. And the costs of solar PV in real terms over the last 8 to 10 years has come down by a factor of 3 or more. And that economic benefit of mass production and grid scale systems is something that we can take advantage of in built environment systems on our rooftops. So what we've looked at in Willmott Dixon is ways in which we can help our customers to do that for net zero buildings, and we've come up with an innovative approach to providing solar PV energy on a pay for the energy basis as opposed to pay for the equipment to make the energy. And we're in the process of rolling that out on various projects currently with some of our customers, including the one you see here, which is in the final stages of design with on a large special educational needs school that we're building for Wiltshire Council, where we'll be generating almost as much energy as we are consuming in the building, and in the way you saw with Hackbridge School earlier on. And finally, innovation in solar generation and energy happens in your neck of the woods and a very progressive development that a number of you may be aware of in Nottingham at Trent Basin, where the developers Blueprint and their partners have installed battery storage in the form of Tesla battery system you see at the top right, solar PV generation on the development, part of which was built by Willmott Dixon, and a combination of those energy systems to provide effectively a private wire electricity network to the development and give the residents and the occupiers of those homes all of the benefits of low carbon systems and moving towards a net zero kind of development for the future. So a great example there of that kind of innovation. And the last step in our journey is perhaps the most important one, because all of the prior steps are really, design and build processes, and we've done all the good stuff. We've reduced our energy, we've reduced our embodied emissions, we've provided lots of renewable generation, but unless we actually measure and verify that all of that stuff is actually delivering the predicted amount of energy usage and the predicted amount of generation, then it's not really a net zero building in actuality, and that's what we actually need to achieve to make an impact on climate change. So that M&V part of the process is really important, and I can show you here an example of how a passive house building in Leicester, the one you saw earlier at the university, has been tracked through its performance in the first 2 or 3 years of operation and actually achieved a measured performance outcome, as you see there in the display energy certificate, that's equivalent to less than 25% of the carbon emissions of a typical building of its type. Not quite at net zero levels in overall terms, but in energy efficiency terms it is. And from Leicester's standpoint, an award-winning building, and one which has given them some significant benefits in the estate. And you can see here quite a graphic comparison of the new building on the right compared to the existing medical school building across the road in terms of amount of energy consumed and the annual cost of that energy. Quite a significant difference for the university and a significant improvement in its estate quality, as well as in its operating costs of ownership. At Willmott Dixon, we took some of the learning from that project and we used that to develop a system process called Energy Synergy, which essentially is a process to target energy performance and measure against that target value in operation. And we've used that process on a number of pilot projects over the last 2 or 3 years while we've been developing the approach. One of which is at the University of Warwick on one of their large sports centres that we completed there a couple of years ago. We used the process there to, as you see in the next slide, comparing target performance with actual performance on a monthly basis and identifying areas where savings could be made or where there's a discrepancy between expected performance and actual performance. One of those you see bottom right there is the energy performance associated with gym equipment, showing a typical day of use from midnight to midnight. And you can see there, although obviously it peaks during the day when the equipment's being used, there's a significant amount of out of hours usage, accounting for almost a third of total consumption. Simple things around standby equipment and how that functionality is implemented or not in this case. Very useful learning there, which allowed the university to change its operating regime and make significant savings. And you can see there in terms of the overall benefits of that process on the building, the kinds of numbers that we looked at saving in terms of potential saving levels, in terms of different systems by way of PV generation or consumption, and the carbon and cost savings associated with that. And if you'd like to hear a few direct views from our customer, Joel from the University Sustainability Group, there's a couple of articles on our website there where he's talking about the use of energy synergy on this building and also some subsequent projects we've delivered for the university. So that concludes my rather rapid spin through net zero carbon buildings, and during the Q&A I'll be happy to take any questions from you about how we all need to rise to this industry challenge of net zero. Thanks very much.
Huge thank you to all of our speakers today for those really interesting insights and, you know, case studies as well on the journey towards net zero carbon. As I mentioned in the chat when I sent you all a message recently, we have now been joined for a Q&A by Alasdair, Matt and Tom. Unfortunately, Anesh has been unable to join us today due to circumstances beyond his and our control. So we miss him, but it was great to hear from him in the pre-recorded section of today's webinar. So we're going to get stuck into the Q&A now. We've got our guests with us until around 3 o'clock, sorry, I'm in like an hour behind. It's watching too much Euros on the television. I'll confess. So we've got about 20 minutes or so to have a bit of a Q&A. So if you do want to ask any questions, please pop it into the Q&A box and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But for the time being, I've got a question for you, Alasdair. We're going to come to you first with this one. How much of an uptake are Willmott Dixon seeing when it comes to projects like this with sustainability that are truly at its core?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Danielle. I'd say until the last year or two, sort of pre-lockdown really, that was a rarity. I'd say in the last 12 to 18 months, I'd say a good quarter or more of our customers are proactively coming to us on projects that we are currently developing at design stage with some kind of objective in relation to net zero carbon, largely driven by those climate emergency declarations that, that a lot of people on the call today, I'm sure, are struggling with implementing, and that Leicester are showing a great example of how they're doing that. So that's going to become the norm, I think, pretty quickly for new build construction and major refurbishment projects, and that's a good thing. That's what we need to do.
How many years away from it being the norm do you think we are?
I'd say for 2 or 3 years. If I'm going to be put a number out there, maybe 5, but that would be a shame. But we've set ourselves, as I think I mentioned briefly, target as a business to deliver all of our projects to that standard by 2030. So we've given ourselves 10 years. I think we actually need to move faster than that as a country, and we have the technology and we have the ability to do that now. We just need to to crack on, really.
Absolutely, that's a good way of just crack on. I like that, definitely. Now, Matt, I'm going to come to you. This Leicester project used some existing features, which obviously makes a saving when it comes to embodied carbon. But we appreciate there might not be any specific figures available. But what generally is the amount of saving there, or the potential for saving there, when it comes to retaining these features?
I think it's significant. Certainly, the steelwork would be one of the largest carbon content elements of the project. Therefore, that saving alone must give us a good sort of 20-30% chunk, I would expect. The block paving externally of the apron would give us, again, another big saving. I think a lot of the concrete that would go into the foundations, we were able to avoid again. But there are elements still in there, you know, let's not shy away from it. There's still a ground floor slab to be laid. So, yeah, I'd have thought somewhere in that sort of 20-40% region, I would have expected.
Fantastic. Now, Tom, coming to you with this one, we understand that other cities have seen Leicester's plans around the bus station and spoken to you about replicating them. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, you know, this is just good business practice, really. The need to address the climate emergency, and you know, a lot of local authorities are stepping up to that. They know they've got to improve the infrastructure to minimise other forms of transport. Specifically the car, and so it's great to see everyone sort of getting on the bus, so to speak, in relation to this particular strategy. You know, and unless those environments that you're creating are more positive, then people aren't going to use them. You know, where if it's a tram or a bus or a train, if it's overcrowded, if it's unpleasant, if it's not a good environment, if the destination when you arrive doesn't support those same objectives, then you know people are going to struggle to make that leap. You know, so you guys, it's all very well dictating how these things are going to be, but ultimately you have to provide people with a better offer and give them that extra incentive to make the leap.
Of course, absolutely. Now, Alasdair, let's come back to you with this next one. You touched on the scale of the challenge posed by embodied carbon. What are the key points of Willmott Dixon's approach when it comes to tackling this?
Yeah, the step one in our journey there is counting it. You know, in comparison, we've spent many years in the engineering and construction industry counting energy emissions from buildings in operational terms and having detailed models and doing all kinds of stuff. We don't routinely do that for embodied carbon, and there are lots of good tools out there. We are starting to use one particular tool that's sort of BIM linked, that's very efficient in doing that. But until you put a number on it, until you measure it, it's just impossible to accurately do options analysis and trade-offs between embodied emissions and operational emissions and so on. So that's the key step for us. I think the next big one is concrete, and less so steel, because that's really a fairly well known one. It's all about recycled content and so on. But concrete is the big issue, and concrete containing products. That's what the industry needs to solve. Because if you look at any bill of quants for an embodied carbon, if you like, from a surveyor standpoint, top of the list is concrete usually. So be interested to hear some of the academic community or others that are going to give us some good edge there.
Absolutely. Well, calling out to anyone who's watching right now, give us the answer in the Q&A box below. You've got 10 minutes to answer that big question that Alice has just put to you. Matt, let's come to you. So you mentioned that all of the carbon offsetting for this project was done on site. How difficult is it to offset all carbon on site and not resort to using potential off-site methods, and is one preferable to the other?
Well, obviously, saving it on site is definitely preferable. It's sorting out keeping your own house in order, if you like, rather than relying on something separate. But on our particular project, it's not easy to hit a net zero carbon definition on any project, but we did benefit from having a relatively large roof area to floor area, and there's kind of no getting away from that. So we were fortunate in the fact that we could cover the roof in PV, and we were able to make that adjustment relatively simply to the design, because it's just sort of an add-on item. And so with a building footprint that was much smaller, much taller, you would start to have a little bit more of a difficulty in achieving that. And that's then when I think you start to have to look at other elements of it, and whether that's off-site or other options on site, that might be a solution. We could have looked at other things such as sort of ground source heat pumps, but just with that city centre environment, it's quite a constrained site. So there are other options, but I think they come with their own difficulties.
Of course, it's always one, can't have one without the other, can you? I suppose is the age-old conundrum. Now, Tom, you're an architect, of course. How do you go about juggling creating a great building that's fantastic aesthetically when it has such a tight sustainability brief as we had in this case?
Well, fundamentally, you start with best practice. And I remember when I came out of college, we were all singing, the praises of sustainable approaches and how much saving that was going to lead to both energy consumption and whatever. But 25 years ago, people didn't want to hear about it. Even to the point where you threaten with the sack if you mentioned that sustainability word, because they don't care, commercial sort of ventures. The big change has been the legislation and the strategies that people are now evidently required to adopt, and those that are choosing to adopt these things sort of at early stages, have a significant benefit as associated. So, our strategy is always to try and think if you can repurpose, reuse, recycle as a start point, and then you're into sort of energy mitigation. So one of the things that people don't always understand is that just the use of the building, people being in the building, generates heat, and that then needs cooling. So ironically, it's the cooling of those environments which generates a huge amount of energy consumption. So anything you do in terms of natural ventilation, in terms of strategies where you're mitigating that energy consumption in the first place, are ideal. And so a building like this one at the bus station, effectively that concourse area is not heated, so that helps. The areas that are heated and cooled to some degree, are obviously relatively small in comparison to the rest of it, and therefore that coupled with the reusing the structural frame, maximizing the natural ventilation where we can, maximize the amount of solar energy that can be generated from the roof areas, all of those sort of played into the hands of the team really, and were immediately seized upon as good ideas that should be continued through.
Really interesting, thank you. And it's something that maybe, I personally didn't know that myself, so maybe something a lot of people maybe didn't consider. We've got time for kind of one more question for each of our panelists, so if you do have any questions, quickly get them into that Q&A box and we'll try and sneak them in for you. Alasdair, coming back to you. So you talked a lot about Passive House, obviously, in your presentation. How difficult is it to attain Passive House standards? Are there any types of buildings that are particularly hard to attain that level with, for example?
No, there are buildings that are easier than others to attain Passive House, but the principles of Passive House are all about early design, and we've worked with CPW and others on those principles when we delivered the Leicester project. It's a good standard. It's a really robust standard that's proved successful on lots and lots of building types, from individual homes to massive university buildings and towers. And because the fundamentals of it are good, and it's a good discipline. We found that, as well as being a great sustainable building, it's actually driven a high quality sort of ethos with our supply chain partners in a pride in creating something that's kind of considered exemplar in overall quality terms, as well as in energy efficiency and sustainability terms. So it's a good standard, and it's one that's going to, along with net zero, is going to grow, I think.
And that's what we're striving for, isn't it? Of course, at the end of the day. Matt, coming to you for this final question for you. As an M&E consultant, what was it that maybe first jumped out at you about the building when you first went to have a look, or saw it in pictures, however you first saw it, that made you go, wow, we need to change that or that or that? What was the first thing that jumped out for you?
I think it was just the presence of the building in the city, and that sort of street scene, and what Tom and his team's created now, and that difference. And it's quite remarkable seeing the presentation, the before and after at the end there, sort of see it side by side. For me, that's the huge difference. I think the thing that was sort of jumped out to us at first was just that whole contradiction between the large amount of glazing and the energy targets, and just trying to get that to work as a solution that's both energy efficient and giving that visibility for the passengers out onto the apron area as well. Having that north facing as well made a real difference.
Yes, definitely. And I agree, those before and afters, they were quite the transformation, weren't they? Absolutely. Final question is for you, Tom, and this is coming from Carl Letton, asking, with zero carbon buildings, do you think there's a need for greater communication with building users to explain, one, how the building functions, and two, the user's role within that as of such?
I do find that, probably when requirements are sort of stipulated and incorporated into the building, quite often it's highly dependent on management systems and reporting structures and all that. And I think anything we can do to minimize the amount of extra effort that has to be done, it should be automatically easy to use. It should be, automatically simpler to choose to make the right decision. You shouldn't have to think whether you flush the toilet or not. It should just be, you should be mitigating the water consumption. When you're walking into a building, the lights should come on. They should be low energy consuming lights. These things are quite straightforward. So the additional levels of management sometimes get in the way, where you can't open a window because the computer says no. The level of comfort that different people have is so variable. And I think what you'll see probably over time to come is just better engineered systems, simpler engineered systems, and more automatic sort of functions so people don't have to really think about it. They're automatically making good decisions about how they use a building and how its energy is consumed and mitigated.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's as good an answer to end on as any. Thank you so much to all three of you, for answering all of those questions. Got through quite a lot in that Q&A time. That's all for the Q&A. Thank you, as I say, so much, everyone, for answering those questions. And we'll hand over now to Umesh, who's going to bring today's webinar to a close.
Thanks, Danielle. That brings us to an end to today's webinar. Thank you to Anish, Tom, Matthew and Alasdair for joining us this afternoon, and of course for you two watching as well. So if you are not a member of ProCon and wish to join, please do get in touch. Our contact information is easily found on both the Nottinghamshire and Leicestershire websites and on the confirmation emails that will send to you for this webinar. We're going to be taking a short break from our monthly webinars over the summer months in the hope that we can resume events around September. So do keep an eye out for your inboxes and see what's next for both ProCons. But for now, have a lovely afternoon and summer, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.